An officer came home with his loyal German Shepherd after a week away. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then the dog growled, not in anger, but in warning. It bolted up the stairs, and what they found in that room would stop any father's heart. His little girl, unconscious on the floor, her tiny hand cold and damp with sweat. What happened next will make you cry, and maybe believe in miracles again. Before we begin, tell me where you watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to know how far this story of loyalty and love travels, and if you believe that some angels walk on 4 legs and bark instead of sing, hit that subscribe button, because the story you're about to hear might just change how you see the world. The town of Pine Hollow, Oregon, wasn't the kind of place that changed quickly. The same fog drifted in every morning from the mountain ridge, clinging low over the rooftops and nestling in the tall pines that circled the neighborhood like guardians of an old, unspoken memory. It was late November, and though snow hadn't come yet, winter was already making its presence felt in the way people pulled their coats tighter in the quiet hum of heaters behind frosted windows. James Carter parked his black SUV at the edge of his gravel driveway. The familiar crunch of tires against stone was the first welcome home he'd had in a week. He turned off the engine and exhaled, slow and heavy. Even from outside the car, he could see that the porch light had been left on overnight, its amber glow casting shadows against the wooden slats, a small sign of routine, or maybe forgetfulness. Either way, it reminded him that life at home kept moving, with or without him. At 42, James looked every bit the seasoned cop, square jaw, short-cropped light brown hair tinged with early gray, and the hard eyes of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. His 6-foot frame was still fit from years of field work, but his shoulders carried something heavier than muscle. Grief, mostly, and the bone-deep weariness of single fatherhood. Since his wife, Leah, died from a sudden heart condition 3 years ago, he'd been holding everything together with the steady hands of a man afraid to let go. In the passenger seat sat Ranger, a 7-year-old German Shepherd with a sharp black saddle, tan legs, and a scar on his left paw from their last joint operation. Though officially retired from the force, Ranger still moved with the alertness of a working canine, but at home he was something else entirely. Emily's shadow, her confidant, her silent comfort. Ranger had been there through the worst of it. The funeral, the nights Emily couldn't sleep, the mornings James had to pretend everything was okay. James reached over and scratched Ranger gently behind the ear. "Let's go surprise her, buddy," he said, his voice low and hoarse from too many radio calls and too little sleep. He stepped out of the vehicle, boots crunching on frozen grass, and walked toward the house, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Ranger followed at a steady pace, his steps measured, tail swaying just slightly behind him. The front door, painted deep blue and slightly weather-worn, gave way with a soft creak. The house smelled like cinnamon and something faintly burnt maybe toast or leftover macaroni in the microwave. James smiled. Emily always said she liked the house to smell warm, even if that meant overusing the cinnamon candles in the cabinet. He paused in the doorway, adjusting the strap on his shoulder, listening. The house was quiet, too quiet. No footsteps, no cartoons, no soft humming from upstairs. And not a single bark from Ranger, which was strange, because the dog usually did a small lap through the living room before settling by the stairs or nosing at Emily's door. Instead, Ranger stopped dead in the middle of the hallway. The fur along his spine bristled. His ears pricked forward. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat, not loud, but unmistakable. James looked down, instantly alert. "What is it?" he said, instinctively reaching toward his belt before realizing he wasn't carrying his duty sidearm. Old habits die hard. Ranger didn't answer. He just stared up the staircase, body stiffening, tail low and still. Then, without warning, he bolted. Paws skidding against the hardwood floor, Ranger launched forward and raced up the stairs, his nails clicking in sharp rhythm. His growl had turned into a bark, a single, sharp sound that echoed off the walls. James froze. It wasn't just that Ranger was reacting, it was how. Ranger had never once broken formation. Not at work. Not at home. He had never run ahead of James without command. And he never, ever barked in the house. A chill crept down James's spine, colder than the wind outside. Something was wrong. James Carter's boots pounded up the wooden stairs, each step echoing like a gunshot in the stillness of the house. The hallway at the top was dim, lit only by the faint gray light slipping in through the frosted window at the end of the corridor. Ranger's barks tore through that silence, sharp, frantic, focused. The kind of bark James hadn't heard since their active duty days. This wasn't noise. This was alarm. Ranger stood rigid at the door of Emily's bedroom, ears pinned back, tail down, his entire body blocking the entrance like a sentinel. He barked again, one short, desperate burst, then turned his head toward James as if urging him forward. James didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, and the world narrowed to a single image. Emily. She was crumpled on the hardwood floor, just beyond the bed, half shadowed by the edge of the curtains. Her body was curled in a loose fetal position, arms folded awkwardly beneath her. Her unicorn print pajama top clung to her back, soaked in sweat. Her skin, usually warm and rosy, had turned pale, with a bluish tint around her lips. A thin line of saliva shimmered at the edge of her mouth. For a split second, James couldn't move. His brain refused to process the scene. The silence was deafening now, not the peaceful kind that greeted him in Pine Hollow, but the kind that screamed something had gone terribly wrong. Then instinct snapped him into action. He dropped to his knees beside her, shaking fingers reaching for her wrist. Faint pulse, shallow breaths, but alive. "Emily," he whispered, brushing hair from her face, his voice cracking. "Baby girl, I'm here." Ranger let out a low whine and nudged Emily's hand with his nose, then licked her damp palm gently, as if willing her to wake. James fumbled for his phone, pulled it from his pocket, and hit emergency. 911, what's your emergency? "This is Officer James Carter, badge 2194, he said, voice tight. "My daughter, 10 years old, has collapsed. She has a history of seizures. She's unconscious. I need an ambulance to 223 Pine Hollow Drive, now." "Help is on the way," the dispatcher replied. "Is she breathing?" "Yes. Shallow, but yes." "Stay on the line." "I can't. I need both hands." He ended the call, tossing the phone aside and cradling Emily in his arms, her head resting against his chest. He rocked her gently, whispering her name again and again. Ranger sat close, his amber eyes locked onto her face, ears flicking with every faint sound she made. Downstairs, the soft clang of a cabinet and the hiss of a kettle on the stove broke through the tension like a slap. Someone else was in the house. "Karen!" James shouted, loud enough to shake the picture frames on the wall. "Get up here now!" A few seconds passed, and then hurried footsteps ascended the stairs. Karen Boyd, a woman in her mid-60s, appeared at the top landing. She was short and stout, with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun, thick glasses slipping down the bridge of her nose, and an apron covered in flour. A retired school cafeteria worker, Karen had been helping James part-time since his wife died. She was no-nonsense, reliable, and often quiet around adults, though she adored children and had a deep maternal warmth for Emily. "Mr. Carter?" she asked, startled. Then she saw Emily. Her face went ashen. "Oh my God!" Her hand flew to her mouth. I was downstairs boiling water for tea. She said she wanted to rest." James didn't respond. His focus was on the small chest rising and falling against his shoulder. "I thought she was just napping," Karen stammered. "She was reading when I checked 10 minutes ago." "It wasn't your fault," James muttered, but the words came out hollow. Not because he blamed her, but because he blamed himself. He was the one who'd left. Again. The room smelled faintly of sweat and lavender. Emily's favorite candle, now burned down to a stub on her nightstand. A few colored pencils were scattered on the floor, and a sketchbook lay open beside her bed. On the page, half drawn in soft crayon, was a picture of Ranger and Emily holding hands under a tree. A sun with a smiling face shone above them. James blinked hard and looked away. The sound of approaching sirens began to rise in the distance, muffled but steady. Help was close. "Blankets," James said suddenly. "Bring me 2-1 for the floor, one to cover her." Karen nodded and hurried away. Ranger shifted slightly, repositioning himself beside Emily's legs, placing his head gently across her ankles. His breathing slowed, calm but alert. He never took his eyes off her face. James stroked Emily's hair and whispered, "You're okay. You're going to be okay." But inside, the guilt clawed at him. 3 years of being strong, 3 years of schedules, medications, and routines. 3 years of telling himself she was fine, she was stable, that he didn't need to hover. But what if he had come home tomorrow instead of today? What if Ranger hadn't sensed something? Dogs like him didn't bark unless something was wrong. And the fact that Ranger, old, disciplined, trained to obey above all else, had broken every rule they'd ever taught him, barked and bolted and led James to her. That fact haunted him. Karen returned with the blankets just as the ambulance lights splashed across the walls outside. She helped lay them down, tears silently falling behind her glasses. Ranger didn't move. He stayed right where he was, a silent guardian by his girl's side. The hospital was like most small-town hospitals in rural Oregon, clean, but old, functional, but far from polished. Willamette Valley Medical Center had only 2 pediatric rooms on the 2nd floor, and Emily Carter now occupied one of them. The only light in the room a soft glow from the monitor beside her bed. Outside, the fog had thickened, clinging to the hospital windows like frostbitten fingers. It was mid-afternoon, but the grayness made it feel like evening. James Carter sat in a vinyl chair pulled close to the side of the bed. His elbows rested on his knees, his hands folded tightly in front of him. His short-cropped hair was slightly damp from the earlier drizzle, and he hadn't changed out of his fleece-lined patrol jacket, the collar still turned up from the cold. His face, though stoic as ever, showed signs of fraying jaw clenched, dark circles under his eyes, lips pressed in a thin line. Emily lay still on the hospital bed. Her breathing was stable now, though faint. A pulse oximeter wrapped around her finger blinked steadily. Electrodes dotted her small forehead, their wires trailing to a machine that quietly measured her brain activity. A nasal cannula provided oxygen, her cheeks just barely rising with each breath. Beside her, Ranger lay curled on the floor, his front legs stretched forward, his chin resting gently on Emily's ankle beneath the blanket. He didn't sleep. He just watched her, ears twitching slightly whenever a monitor beeped or a nurse's voice echoed in the hallway. Dr. Priya Desai entered the room, clipboard in hand. In her early 40s, Dr. Desai was of Indian descent, petite, with dark eyes that spoke of long nights and hard truths. Her long black hair was tied back into a tight ponytail, and her scrubs bore the faded blue emblem of the pediatric ward. She was known throughout the valley not only for her precision, but also for her ability to deliver bad news with a kindness that didn't feel rehearsed. James stood immediately when she entered. "Well?" She offered a small nod before speaking. "It was a seizure, a strong one. Her chart says she hasn't had any incidents in the last 10 months. "None," James replied. "Not since we got the meds balanced." Dr. Desai glanced at the chart again. Something's shifted. Maybe stress, maybe growth. But her levels are unstable again. We'll need to keep her here for a few days, monitor her response, possibly adjust the dosage or look into long-term alternatives. James exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders not loosening in the slightest. "You're saying it's back." "I'm saying we need to treat it like it is," she replied, voice gentle but firm. "She was lucky this time." He nodded. His eyes flicked back to his daughter, her small hand limp against the blanket. "She's 10. She should be playing, not hooked to machines." "She will again," Dr. Desai said softly, "but not if we pretend she's invincible." There was a beat of silence. Then came the knock at the door. Karen Boyd stepped inside, holding a styrofoam cup of hospital coffee in both hands. She had changed into a thick gray cardigan over her blouse, and her bun looked slightly messier than earlier. Her face was pale, and the creases near her mouth seemed deeper now. She didn't look James in the eyes. I wanted to see how she was," Karen said. Dr. Desai gave James a quick look, then excused herself quietly, promising to return with test results later. Karen took a tentative step forward, but James didn't move. "She asked to read alone," Karen continued. "She does that sometimes. I didn't think—" James didn't raise his voice, but the edge in his tone was sharper than steel. "You left her upstairs while you were texting in the kitchen." Karen's lips parted, but she didn't deny it. "I thought she'd call if she needed anything." "She couldn't." Karen's hands shook slightly as she held the coffee. "I made a mistake." "Yes, you did," James said coldly. He looked down at Emily again, then at Ranger, who hadn't moved from his post on the floor. "I should have known," Karen whispered. James finally looked up. "You've known her for 2 years. You know her history. You were supposed to be the backup when I couldn't be there. You were supposed to watch her." Karen's shoulders slumped. She was an older woman, used to being the one who knew what to do, the one others depended on. But at that moment, she looked lost, like a mother who'd lost her place in someone else's home. "I'll leave if you want me to," she said quietly. James looked at her for a long moment. "Not now," he muttered. "Emily likes you." Karen gave a small nod and turned to leave, closing the door behind her. The room fell into silence again, broken only by the faint rhythm of machines. Ranger blinked slowly, then repositioned himself slightly, pressing his head closer to Emily's leg. James reached down and ran a hand over the dog's back, his fingers sliding through the thick fur. "You knew," James murmured. "You knew something was wrong." Ranger didn't move, but his eyes closed just for a second at the sound of James's voice. James sat back down, his hand never leaving Ranger's back, his gaze never leaving Emily. The house was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of bedtime stories or lazy Sunday mornings, but the heavy, uncertain silence that follows after too many hours spent at a hospital bedside. James Carter stood in the doorway of Emily's room, still wearing the same jacket he'd had on when he carried her out to the ambulance. The air smelled faintly of lavender and crayons, just like always. A blanket was half folded on her bed, and a pair of slippers lay forgotten near the desk. Ranger padded in behind him, silent, deliberate. The old German shepherd didn't wander the way he used to. Every movement he made had purpose. James dropped his duffel on the floor and ran a hand over his face. He hadn't come home to sleep. He'd come home to grab a few things for Emily. Maybe a book, her favorite sweater, something familiar to bring back to her sterile hospital room. But he stood still. Ranger moved toward the desk in the corner. He sniffed once, then sat beside it. His tail didn't wag. His eyes flicked up toward James and then down again. He lifted one paw and tapped the front panel of the bottom drawer, just once, then looked up again. James raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Ranger didn't move. He simply stared. James crossed the room, crouched, and placed a hand on the drawer handle. He gave it a tug. It stuck. It always had. Emily had broken the runners by overstuffing it with art supplies and journals. He tugged harder, and with a creak, it gave way. Inside was a small stack of papers held together with a purple rubber band. Folded pages, labeled in pencil. "To Mommy." James stared. His throat tightened. He reached in slowly and pulled them out, sliding the rubber band free. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the first letter. "Dear Mommy, I miss you. I miss the way you tucked me in and hummed when I was scared. I try not to cry anymore. I try to be strong like Daddy says I should. But sometimes I don't want to be strong. Sometimes I just want someone to say it's okay to be scared." James felt the breath catch in his chest. He turned to the next page. "If I get sick again, I don't want Daddy to think I did something wrong. I don't want him to look at me like I failed him. I don't want to ruin his day. If I'm weak, he'll think I'm a burden." James closed his eyes. Ranger let out a soft whine beside him. Another letter. "When I feel dizzy, I sit down and count like you taught me. But sometimes it still hurts. I don't tell Daddy because he worries, and when he worries, he gets quiet. And when he gets quiet, I feel like I did something wrong." James placed the papers gently on the desk. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders tight. He had no idea she'd been carrying this much. All this time, he thought silence meant strength, that pushing through pain was what he needed to teach her, but all he had taught her was how to hide it. He looked down at Ranger, who was now lying on the rug with his head resting on his paws, close but not intrusive. "You knew, didn't you?" James whispered. "You always know." Ranger blinked slowly. James sat down on the edge of the bed and let the letters rest in his lap. The edges of the pages were curled, as if they'd been read and reread. These weren't just letters, they were confessions, small, quiet truths. Emily hadn't been able to say out loud, and he hadn't made space for her to say them. He wanted her to be strong, because he didn't know how to protect anything fragile anymore. But she was fragile, and brave, and hurting. He ran a hand through his hair, letting it rest on the back of his neck as he stared at the wall. The room hadn't changed. The photos, the lamp shaped like a rabbit, the stack of chapter books on her shelf, all still here. Still hers. He placed the letters back in the drawer, gently, carefully, just as they were. He didn't take them with him. They weren't his to take, but he wouldn't forget them. Not this time. As he stood to leave, Ranger rose and followed. No bark, no sound. Just quiet footsteps echoing through a quiet house. The hospital hallway was nearly silent, except for the occasional murmur from the nurse's station and the soft humming of machines keeping time with sleeping hearts. It was nearing 2 a.m., and most of Willamette Valley Medical Center had drifted into its graveyard rhythm. Fluorescent lights dimmed, footsteps softened, and the world outside washed in quiet fog. Inside room 206, the light above Emily Carter's bed glowed faintly. The curtain was half drawn. Ranger was sprawled across the floor at the foot of the bed, his chin resting flat on his paws, one ear perked lazily in sleep. James Carter sat slouched in the chair next to Emily, elbows on his knees, fingers steepled against his forehead. His eyes, red-rimmed and dry, were locked on the linoleum tiles, but his mind was 100 miles away, in letters folded into a drawer, in a little girl's voice too quiet for him to hear until it was written down. Then a rustle. James looked up. Emily stirred beneath the thin blanket, her hand twitching slightly, lashes fluttering like leaves in wind. She let out a small sigh, lips parting. Her voice, when it came, was dry, threadbare. "Ranger?" Ranger's ears twitched. In one fluid movement the dog rose, padded quietly to the side of the bed and laid his chin on the mattress beside her. Emily turned her head toward him slowly, her pale lips curving into the softest smile. "You stayed," she whispered. James stood, stepping closer, unsure whether to say something or let the moment be hers. Emily reached out, weak fingers brushing through Ranger's fur, eyes half-lidded, but conscious. "Hey, baby," James said softly. "You're awake." Emily looked up at him, her expression sleepy but calm. "Hi, Daddy." He tried to smile, failed. "You scared me." "I didn't mean to," she murmured. He sat beside her bed, pulling the chair closer, elbows still resting on his thighs. For a moment they just sat, father, daughter, and dog without speaking. Then Emily broke the silence. "I felt it coming," she said. James looked up. "The seizure?" She nodded faintly. "My head started buzzing yesterday, but I didn't want to ruin things. You were coming home." His throat tightened. "You knew I was coming?" "I heard Ranger bark different in the hallway," she said. "I thought maybe you were home." James swallowed hard. He reached for her hand, small, warm, shaking slightly, and held it between both of his. "I read your letters," he said quietly. Her eyes widened just a little. "I wasn't trying to snoop," he added quickly. "Ranger showed me." Emily's fingers curled slightly around his. "You weren't supposed to see them." "I know," James replied, "but I'm glad I did." Emily stared up at the ceiling. "I didn't want you to think I was weak." "You're not," James said instantly. I just wanted you to be proud, she whispered. James leaned in closer. Emily, I'm proud of you every single day. You don't say it. I know, he said. That's my fault. She was quiet for a beat. Then, in the smallest voice, do you blame me? When I get sick? The question hit like a punch to the ribs. James felt the wind leave his chest. No, he said. God, no. Emily, none of this is your fault. But you get so quiet, she whispered, like I let you down. I get quiet, he said, voice cracking, because I'm scared, and because I don't know how to fix things, and because, when your mom died, I promised myself I'd keep you safe. So when something happens and I can't stop it, I feel like I failed. Emily's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. You didn't fail. James took a breath, then another, before finally saying it. I'm sorry. Emily looked over at him. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to hide, he continued. I'm sorry I made strong seem more important than honest. And I'm sorry for not hearing you sooner. I missed you, she whispered. I missed you too, James replied. More than anything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ranger laid down between them now, pressing his body along the side of the bed, resting his head on his paws. His breathing was slow, steady, rhythmic like a quiet drumbeat reminding them both they were not alone. Emily ran her fingers along his ear absently. He never leaves. He doesn't, James said. When you're not home, she added softly, I tell him things I'm scared to tell you. James nodded. I think he tells me in his own way. He's my best friend. I know, James smiled. Then, carefully, as if the words were heavy, Emily asked, Will you stay this time? James didn't hesitate. As long as you want me to. She smiled. The machines beeped. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. I don't want to be brave all the time, she said. You don't have to be. Even if I cry? Especially if you cry. Emily let out a breath she'd been holding for months. I love you, she said. I love you too, kiddo. So much. James leaned in and kissed her forehead, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Outside, the fog clung to the windows like a soft blanket. Inside, the room felt warmer, lighter. Ranger shifted just slightly, placing his body between them like a living bridge, his presence quiet but immense. He was more than a dog. He was the keeper of unspoken words, the witness to every moment they were too afraid to share, and tonight, he simply stayed. The Carter house had never been extravagant. Nestled at the edge of Pine Hollow, it was a modest two-story home with weathered siding and an old maple tree that creaked in the wind. But inside, James Carter was trying to create something more than shelter. After the long nights in the hospital, after every quiet apology and whispered promise, he knew the space around them needed to reflect something new. Something healing. It started with the room at the end of the hall. It had once been James's home office. A small, square space that smelled faintly of printer ink and dust, with a heavy oak desk pressed against one wall and unopened boxes stacked in the corner. For years it had served as a reminder of things he didn't finish. His attempt at writing a training manual, organizing old case files, sorting through Leah's things. But now, it would become something else entirely. A room for Emily. James stood in the doorway, arms crossed, surveying the room. His hair was slightly tousled, still damp from his morning shower, and he wore an old gray hoodie with faded letters that read, State Police Academy. Behind him, Ranger entered quietly, his large frame moving with practiced ease. His coat shone in the morning light streaming through the window, and his steps made no sound on the hardwood. James looked down at him. We're changing it up, buddy. Ranger gave a short wag of his tail, then padded across the room to sniff at a pile of boxes. By noon, James had removed the desk and cleared the corners. The walls were bare, but sunlight poured in from the west-facing window, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny stars. It didn't take long to realize that the room already felt different, less like a workspace and more like a blank page. He went to the local hardware store, where he ran into Dave Miles, the store manager, a retired firefighter with a beer belly and a kind demeanor. Dave had thinning white hair and always wore the same faded red flannel no matter the season. He greeted James with a hearty slap on the back and a few good-natured jabs about how long it had been since he last saw him buying anything that wasn't duct tape. "You turning into a handyman, Carter?" Dave asked with a chuckle. "Trying something new," James said. "Building a room for my daughter." Dave's face softened. "That's a good project. What's she into?" "Drawing, reading, anything that makes her forget the hospital." Dave nodded, then helped James pick out a small bookshelf, some pastel wall paint called Winter Sky, and a reading lamp shaped like a bunny. By the time James got home, Ranger was already waiting at the door. They spent the rest of the day transforming the space. James painted while Ranger lay near the doorway, occasionally shifting to keep eyes on each movement. The bookshelf went up next, filled with Emily's favorite titles dog stories, fairy tales, mysteries. A small table and 2 chairs were added near the window, where sunlight could land on whatever page she was coloring. And in the corner, James placed a large round dog bed lined with thick fleece, the same shade as Ranger's tan fur. Above it, he mounted a small framed photo, one of the only family pictures taken before Leah passed. Emily was just 7, sitting between James and Leah, Ranger in her lap, ears perked, tongue out. James stared at the photo for a long while before stepping back. That night, James brought Emily home. She was tired, pale, but smiling in the way only a child could after surviving something big. Her small frame was wrapped in her favorite hoodie, and her eyes lit up the moment Ranger ran ahead of her into the hallway. "Wait, why's he going into your office?" she asked. "You'll see." James opened the door and Emily stepped inside. Her breath caught. The pale blue walls, the bookshelf, the drawing table, the corner bed for Ranger, the photo. It all hit her at once. She turned to James. "You made this?" He nodded, a little awkwardly. "It's yours now, for whatever you want, drawing, reading, hiding when the world's too loud." Emily looked around slowly, eyes wide. "It feels safe." "That's the point." She walked to the table, touched the colored pencils arranged neatly in a glass jar. Then she sat, pulled a blank page from a notebook, and began to draw. James stepped out, giving her space. Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep, James quietly opened the door to her bedroom. She was curled on her side, her blanket pulled up to her chin, her sketchbook lying open beside her. On the page was a drawing of the new room. In the corner, she had drawn Ranger, smiling. In the center, herself, and her dad smiling too. James smiled faintly and stepped back, opening his phone. He tapped on the newly installed app connected to the security camera he had quietly mounted in her room earlier that day. It wasn't invasive, just a way for him to make sure she was safe, especially if the seizures returned. He checked the feed. All clear. From the foot of the bed, Ranger stirred and looked up. "You're on night duty," James whispered. "Like always." Ranger gave a soft grunt of acknowledgement, then stood, stretched, and leapt gently onto the end of the bed. He curled up near Emily's feet, placing his head beside her ankle. An hour later, Emily whimpered in her sleep, her face tensing. Ranger lifted his head, ears perked. She twitched again, a short gasp. Without hesitation, Ranger moved closer, resting his snout on her chest and gently nudging upward. Emily stirred, her face relaxing as her hand found his fur. She didn't fully wake, but she smiled, and Ranger, satisfied, settled back down, pressing close enough that she could feel him there. James, watching from the doorway, felt something shift in his chest, not panic, not fear, relief. They were home. The frost had finally melted off the pine trees lining Pine Hollow, and with spring beginning to stretch its limbs, the Carter household had settled into something rare, peace. It had been a month since Emily returned from the hospital, and though James still checked the baby monitor every night and occasionally glanced at the seizure log like it might explode, something had changed in the rhythm of their lives. Not everything was perfect, but it was no longer precarious. Emily's color had returned. Her appetite was back. Her laughter, soft and hesitant at first, had grown louder with each passing day. She still tired easily. still had quiet moments where her head rested on Ranger's flank and her fingers clutched a pencil mid-sketch, but she was okay. For now, she was okay. The house, too, reflected that shift. The once quiet living room was now scattered with crayons, books, and dog toys. Ranger's presence was a constant hum throughout the day. The old German Shepherd had taken his job of personal security detail to the next level, moving from room to room wherever Emily went. His eyes tracking her movements, his ears always alert. His fur had grown a touch grayer around the muzzle, but his loyalty burned as brightly as ever. James had started reading aloud to Emily every evening before bed. He wasn't a natural storyteller. His voice was deep and sometimes too serious, but Emily loved it. It became their ritual. Sometimes she picked old fairy tales. Other nights she chose mystery books with clever dogs and brave kids. And always Ranger would lie between them, chin on paws, eyes closed, listening. On Saturday mornings, Emily would bring her sketchpad down to the kitchen table while James brewed coffee. She drew constantly images of Ranger sleeping beneath the stars, of their house on a hill, of her mother smiling in the kitchen with sunlight across her shoulders. The portraits weren't perfect, but they held something deeper than technique. They carried heart. One morning, while sorting mail, James found a flyer folded between a utility bill and a grocery coupon. It was printed on bright paper with watercolor splashes and bold lettering. Pine Hollow Annual Youth Art Showcase, ages 6 to 12. Theme: What makes you feel see? He read the line again. Emily was sitting nearby on the floor, drawing Ranger curled up next to her in their reading nook. "Hey," he said, holding out the flyer, "what do you think about this?" She looked up, then took the paper and read it silently. A few seconds passed. Her eyes lifted. "Can I draw Ranger?" "You'd better," James said with a grin. "He's not going to forgive you if you don't." Emily giggled and got to work. Over the next few days, she poured every ounce of effort into that one picture. It wasn't flashy, just a sketch in colored pencil on textured paper, but it captured something true. In it, Ranger stood in front of a storm, his body shielding a small girl clutching a stuffed animal. Behind them was a house with one light glowing in the window. The sky above was swirling, but the girl looked calm. Safe. Emily titled it My Guardian. They submitted it the following Monday. James tried not to get his hopes up, but inside he was proud. Not just of the drawing, but of the fact that his daughter was strong enough now to put her feelings on paper and send them into the world. 2 weeks later, they received a letter. James opened it first, then read it aloud to Emily, who was sitting cross-legged on the couch with Ranger curled against her back. Dear Emily Carter, we are pleased to inform you that your artwork, My Guardian, has been selected as one of the winning entries for this year's Youth Art Showcase. Your drawing touched the hearts of our judges with its emotional depth and quiet strength. Congratulations! Emily gasped, then covered her face with both hands. I won? You won. Ranger let out a small huff, lifting his head as if in agreement. Do you think they knew it was about him? Emily asked, pointing her thumb at the dog beside her. I think everyone who looks at it will know, James said. It's him. She crawled over and wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck. The dog shifted slightly but allowed it, letting his head rest against her shoulder as her fingers stroked his fur. He really is my guardian, she whispered, even when I was sick, even when I didn't know I was scared. James watched the two of them from the armchair, heart full. There was still a long road ahead, but for now, in this moment, he was just grateful for the silence, for the laughter, for the quiet days, and for a dog who had never once left his daughter's side. The night sky above Pine Hollow had never felt so wide. A full moon hung like a silver coin in the dark, bathing the Carter backyard in a quiet, steady glow. The breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant wildflowers, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves whispering secrets in the dark. James Carter stood barefoot in the grass, the hem of his jeans damp with dew. He wore a flannel shirt over a plain white tee, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hair had grown out slightly in the past few weeks, softening the usually sharp edges of his face. Beside him stood Emily, wrapped in her faded lavender hoodie and holding his hand tightly, her head leaning against his arm. Ranger sat at her other side, ears perked, posture proud and still like a statue carved from devotion. His fur shimmered in the moonlight gray now beginning to mix around the muzzle, but still strong, still steady. His tail wagged once, slow and measured. James looked down at his daughter. "You sure you're not cold?" "I'm fine," she whispered. "This is perfect." The trio stood in silence for a long while, simply watching the stars. James had brought them out here for a reason, but the words hadn't yet come. Sometimes silence said more than words ever could, but not tonight. Tonight, he needed to say them. He knelt down in the grass so his face was level with hers. Emily turned toward him, her eyes reflecting moonlight and a softness he hadn't seen since Leah was alive. He pulled her gently into a hug, one arm around her back, the other reaching for Ranger, drawing him in until the three of them were tangled together. Father, daughter, and dog. "From now on," James said, voice low but clear, "I'm not going to let you feel alone. Not ever again." Emily's chin trembled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she nodded into his shoulder. "You and me," he said, "and Ranger. Always." Her hand reached out, found Ranger's head, and rested there. James looked up at the stars. "You think Mom can see us?" Emily asked. James followed her gaze, the sky endless above them. "Yeah," he said. "I think she never stopped." They sat like that for a while, Ranger lying down between them, James resting one hand on his daughter's back, the other stroking Ranger's fur. The breeze wrapped around them like a second blanket, and eventually, Emily's eyes began to droop. She tried to fight it, but her body leaned heavier against James. Ranger shifted beneath her, supporting her weight, his breathing rhythmic and calming. "Daddy?" "Yeah?" "Promise you won't go away again?" He kissed the top of her head. "I promise." Within minutes, she was asleep, curled up against Ranger's side beneath the small wooden overhang at the back of the house. It had once been Leah's favorite place where she read books, made tea, and watched Emily chase butterflies through the yard. James stayed beside them for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his daughter's chest, the slow blink of Ranger's eyes as he stayed awake, just in case. He wasn't just a dog. He had never been just a dog. He was a guardian, a witness, a companion, a bridge between sorrow and healing, between what had been and what could still be. The moonlight shifted. A beam of soft silver fell through the open window behind them and landed across the floor like a blessing. Emily stirred slightly, sighed, and nestled deeper into Ranger's fur. James looked up again, one last time. "Thank you," he whispered to the sky, to the memory of Leah, to Ranger, to something bigger than himself. And for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. Sometimes God doesn't send lightning bolts or part the seas. Sometimes his miracles come on 4 legs, with a wagging tail, quiet eyes, and a heart full of loyalty. In the silence of fear, he sends love that doesn't speak but stays. In the darkness of grief, he sends comfort in the form of a child's laughter, a father's arms, and a dog's gentle nudge. This story reminds us, healing doesn't always come in one grand moment, it comes in pieces. In forgiveness, in promises whispered under the stars, in the decision to stay. And maybe, just maybe, God doesn't fix everything overnight, but he gives us each other, so we never have to walk through the storm alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment Amen. If you believe God still sends his angels, even the ones with paws. Subscribe and join us for more stories that bring warmth, faith, and the quiet beauty of second chances. May God bless you and everyone you love, tonight and always.